The room into which he had been shown revealed a strange mixture of luxury and squalor. The windows were shuttered and curtainless, the floor was uncarpeted and strewn with packing cases, shavings, newspapers, and boots, and the wallpaper showed the stains left by the pictures and furniture of the previous occupants. On the other hand, the only two armchairs were of the costliest type, and in the litter which covered the tables, cigars, oyster shells, and empty champagne bottles jostled with tins of condensed milk and open sardine cans, with cheap crockery, broken bread, and teacups a quarter full of tea and cigarette ends. His host seemed to be a long time away, and Ransom fell to thinking of Devine. He felt for him that sort of distaste we feel for someone whom we have admired in boyhood for a very brief period, and then outgrown. Devine had learned just a half a term earlier that anyone else that kind of humor which consists in a perpetual parody of the sentimental or idealistic cliches of one's elders. For a few weeks, his references to the dear old place and to playing the game, to the white man's burden and a straight bat, had swept everyone, Ransom included, off of their feet. But before he left Wedenshaw, Ransom had already begun to find Devine a bore. And at Cambridge he had avoided him, wondering from afar how anyone so flashy and, as it were, ready-made could be so successful. Then had come the mystery of Devine's election to the Leicester Fellowship, and the further mystery of his increasing wealth. He had long since abandoned Cambridge for London, and was presumably something in the city. One heard of him occasionally, and one's informant usually ended either by saying, "A darn clever chap, Devine, in his own way," or else by observing plaintively, "It's a mystery to me how that man has got where he is." As far as Ransom could gather from their brief conversation in the yard, his old schoolfellow had altered very little. He was interrupted by the opening of a door. Devine entered alone, carrying a bottle of whiskey on a tray of glasses and a siphon. "Weston is looking for something to eat," he said as he placed the tray on the floor beside Ransom's chair, and addressed himself to opening the bottle. Ransom, who was very thirsty indeed by now, observed that his host was one of those irritating people who forget to use their hands when they begin talking. Devine had started to prise up the silver paper which covered the cork with the point of a corkscrew, and then he stopped to ask, "How do you come to be in this benighted part of the country?" "I'm on a walking tour," said Ransom. "Slept at Stoke Underwood last night and had hoped to end up at Natterbury tonight. They wouldn't put me up, so I was going on to Stirk." "Oh!" exclaimed Devine, his corkscrew idle. "Do you do it for money, or is it sheer masochism?" "Pleasure, of course," said Ransom, keeping his eye immovably on the still unopened bottle. "Can the attraction of it be explained to the uninitiate?" asked Devine, remembering himself sufficiently enough to rip up a small portion of the silver paper. "I hardly know. To begin with, I like the actual walking." "Ah, you must have enjoyed the army. Jogging along to Thingamy, eh?" No, it's just the opposite of the army. The whole point of the army is that you're never alone for a moment, and can never choose where you're going or even what part of the road you're walking on. On a walking tour, you're absolutely detached. You stop where you like, and you go when you like. As long as it lasts, you need to consider no one and consult no one but yourself. Until one might find that a wire waiting at your hotel saying, 'Come back at once,'" replied Devine, at last removing the silver paper. "Well, only if you were fool enough to leave a list of addresses and to go to them. The worst that could happen to me would be that man on the wireless saying, 'Will Dr. Elwyn Ransom believed to be walking somewhere in the Midlands?'" "I begin to see the idea," said Devine, pausing in the very act of drawing the cork. "It wouldn't do if you were in business. You are a lucky devil. But can you even just disappear like that? No wife, no young, no aged but honest parent, or anything of the sort?" "Only a married sister in India, and then you see I'm a Don, and as a Don in the middle of a long vacation, I am almost a non-existent creature. as you ought to remember. The college neither knows nor cares where I am, and certainly nor does anyone else. The cork at last came out of a bottle with a heart-cheering noise. Say when, said Devine, as Ransom held out his glass. But I feel there's a catch here somewhere. Do you really mean to say that no one knows where you are or when you ought to be back, and no one can get a hold of you? Ransom was nodding in reply to Devine, who had picked up the siphon and suddenly swore. I'm afraid this is empty. Do you mind having water? I'll have to get some from the scullery. How much do you like? Fill it up, please, said Ransom. A few minutes later, Devine had returned and handed Ransom his long-delayed drink. The latter remarked, as he put down the half-empty tumbler with a sigh of satisfaction, that Devine's choice of residence was at least as odd as his own choice of holiday. Quite, said Devine. But if you knew Weston, you'd realize that it's much less trouble to go where he wants than to argue the matter. What you call a strong colleague. Colleague? Said Ransom inquiringly. In a sense. Devine glanced at the door, drew his chair closer to Ransom's, and continued in a more confidential tone. He's the goods all right, though. Between ourselves, I'm putting a little money in some experiments he has had on hand. It's all straight stuff, the march of progress and the good of humanity and all that, but it does have an industrial side. While Devine was speaking, something odd began to happen to Ransom. At first, it merely seemed to him that Devine's words were no longer making sense. He appeared to be saying that he was industrial all down both sides, but could never get an experiment to fit him in London, and then he realized that Devine was not so much unintelligible as inaudible, which was not surprising since he was now so far away. About a mile away, though perfectly clear, like something seen through the wrong end of a telescope. From that bright distance where he sat in his tiny chair, he was gazing at Ransom with a new expression on his face. The gaze became disconcerting. Ransom tried to move his chair, but found that he had lost all power over his own body. He felt quite comfortable, but it was as if his legs and arms had been bandaged to the chair and his head gripped by a vice. A beautifully padded, but quite immovable vice. He did not feel afraid, though he knew that he ought to be afraid, and soon would be. Then, very gradually, the room faded from his sight. As Ransom slowly started to come back to, he started to realize that he was again in the armchair and again in a lighted room. A conversation was going on near him and had he now realized, been going on for some time. His head was comparatively clear. He realized that he had been drugged or hypnotized, or both, and he felt that some control over his own body was returning to him, though he was still very weak. He listened intently without trying to move. I'm getting a little tired of this, Weston, Devine was saying, and especially as it's my money that's being risked. I'll tell you, he'll do quite as well as the boy, and in some ways better. Only he'll be coming around very soon now, and we must get him on board once. We ought to have done it an hour ago. The boy was ideal, said Weston sulkily. Incapable of serving humanity, and only too likely to propagate idiocy. He was the sort of boy who in a civilized community would be automatically handed over to a state laboratory for experimental purposes. I dare say, but in England he is the sort of boy in whom the Scotland Yard might conceivably feel an interest. This busybody, on the other hand, will not be missed for months, and even then no one will know where he has disappeared. He came alone, he left no address, he has no family, and he has finally poked his nose into the whole affair of his own accord. Well, I confess I don't like it. He is, after all, human. The boy was really most a preparation. Still, he's only an individual, and probably a quite useless one. We're risking our own lives, too, in a great cause. For the Lord's sake, don't start all that stuff now. We haven't time. I dare say, repeated Weston. If he would consent, he could be made to understand. You take his feet and I'll take his head, said Devine. If you really are thinking he's coming around, said Weston, you'd better give him another dose. We can't start until we get the sunlight, and it wouldn't be pleasant having him struggling in there for 3 hours or so. It would be better if he didn't wake up until we are underway. True enough. Just keep an eye on him while I run upstairs and get another. Devine left the room. Ransom saw through his half-closed eyes that Weston was standing over him. He had no means of foretelling how his own body would respond, if it responded at all, to a sudden attempt of movement, but he saw at once that he must take his chance. Almost before Devine had closed the door, he flung himself with all force at Weston's feet. The scientist fell forward across the chair and on top of Ransom. Flinging him off with agonizing effort, Ransom rose and dashed out into the hall. He was very weak, and he fell as he entered it. But terror was behind him, and in a couple seconds he had found the hall door and was working desperately to master the bolts. Darkness and his trembling hands were against him. Before he had drawn even one bolt, booted feet were clattering over the carpetless floor behind him. He was gripped by the shoulders and knees, kicking, writhing, dripping with sweat. He bellowed as loud as he could, and in the faint hope of rescue, he prolonged the struggle with a violence which he could only have believed himself incapable.